So we are on our third week of our series on the book of Ecclesiastes, a series that we're entitling "Chasing the Wind." So far, we've spent a week talking about the word hevel, all the different meanings of hevel. Last week we talked about time, and during last week's sermon, I gave you a little bit of a heads up that today we'll be talking about another fun, uncomfortable topic of death. The teacher writes lots of poems about the passing of time and the inescapableness of death. And in those kind of bleak poems, we find real wisdom that actually points us to joy if we hear what he's saying, right? I remember my grandpa, we would have these big gatherings on my dad's side of the family, and we'd play wiffle ball. The cousins versus the uncles in wiffle ball. I have a big family, and so we'd play in my uncle's side yard. And I remember my grandpa, when I was really little, he would always say this every time he'd see us do something not smart as a grandkid. He would say, "Youth is wasted on the young." I never understood what he meant by it until I got older, that if we had the wisdom of someone who's lived a lot of life, but the body and the energy and the capacity of somebody who was young, man, would that not be an amazing combination? But if we really hear what the teacher has in store for us today with these two poems on an uncomfortable topic of death, then we can hear that while hindsight may be 2020 and we might still long for those things, we can be part of a church that makes sure that the young lives of our youth aren't wasted, that they are brought up in a correct way with correct perspective. And part of that is enjoying being a kid. So we are at the tail end of Ecclesiastes, the last two poems before the author gives their commentary. So we're going to be in chapters 11 and 12 together this morning. We're going to start by reading this short poem that ends chapter 11. This is what the word of the Lord says. This light is sweet, and it pleases the eyes to see the sun. However many years anyone may live, let them enjoy them all. But let them remember the days of darkness, for there will be many. Everything to come is meaningless. You who are young, be happy while you are young, and let your heart give you joy in the days of your youth. Follow the ways of your heart and whatever your eyes see. But know that for these things, God will bring you into judgment. So then, banish anxiety from your heart and cast off the troubles of your body, for youth and vigor are meaningless. Pleasant, uplifting poem, right? Again, we dive into the writings of a teacher, kind of a cynical older teacher looking back on a life that things haven't quite gone as planned, but they want to point out a thread here that I think we'll continue to see roll over from week 1 to week 2 to this morning. This is a poem written to the young, right? To bring into perspective the gift of youth while simultaneously telling them that youth is fleeting in nature. So it's good, it's not going to last. It's really good, enjoy it, it's not going to last. This is the teacher talking to young people, right? In verse 7, it says, light is sweet and it pleases the eyes to see the sun. If you've been reading Ecclesiastes while we've been going through this series, you know that time and time and time again, there's a contrast here where the teacher says, we toil under the sun. We toil under the sun. We toil for many years. We toil under the sun. The sun, if you think of working outside, if you ever had a manual labor job or you had to do chores or you grew up on a farm and it's hot and it's beating down on you and you're tired. And that's how the sun is talked about for this entire book until this poem. And it says the sun is pleasing to the eyes. It's good. It's nice. It's optimism of a new day. Again, if you could think back to a time when you were up early enough, or maybe you were still up from the night before, and you saw a beautiful sunrise. He says it's pleasing to the eyes to see the sun. There's optimism for something going forward. As a young person, we can say it is pleasing to see the sun. Light is good In the next verse, in verse 8, he says, however many years anyone may live, let them enjoy them all. But let them remember that the days of darkness, right? For they will be many. Everything to come is meaningless. So he says, light is good, it's pleasing to the eyes, but as you're enjoying the sunrise, remember days of darkness are coming. When life is good, remember life will be bad at some point. So there's a kind of immediate optimism met with that kind of cynical, pragmatic nature. You're like, well, we were sounding so positive there, and then he said everything is meaningless. It would be easy for us to read this as saying only do what makes you happy because growing up is horrible. And at some level, maybe at some point in our life, we would agree with that statement. Stay a kid as long as you can because growing up is horrible. But is this good advice for a wise teacher to pass down to young people? Fear growing up. It's really bad. Is it biblical advice? It might be how our modern mind might perceive what he's saying, but is it what he wants us to hear? Rather, we should see verse 8 as kind of a word problem. Have any math people in here who like word problems, right? A couple accountants with their hands up. So word problems. It says life gives you a lot of days. If you're young, life gives you a lot of days. But some of those days aren't good. So we have to factor that into how many good days we have ahead of us. Life is a gift that we should not take for granted, right? We should get up every day and we should say, man, I'm going to do something with today. But if we're being honest with ourselves, we know that's not always the case. When we are younger, it's often because we just think, I have lots and lots of days ahead of me. What makes today special? And when we get older, we might think, I've lived a lot of days that were not so great. Not sure I want to live this one. So no matter how many years you have left, some of them are going to be really difficult. So the math equation, the word problem is your total number of years remaining is not your total number of great years remaining. It would be great in the math, as it were a math problem, if God were to give us those numbers. Like if God were to say, okay, Jacob, you have 41 more years of life left on the planet, and 18 of them are going to be horrible. Then I could say, all right, I could figure that out. I could figure out a plan going forward, but we don't have those numbers. All we know is that generally speaking, young people are promised more time. And if they remember that all of that time is not going to be great, then it leads to a life well lived because they value the time they do have. Right? Life is brief. We've been talking about this word hevel every day, every time we've done this, and it says meaningless every time in the NIV, but this morning in both poems, when you see the word hevel, you should think of the word fleeting or brief. Life is brief. If we remember this, it serves us well. So this is a poem for young people. In verse 9, it says, be happy while you are young. Follow the ways of your heart and whatever your eyes see. But know God will bring you into judgment. So it says we ought to enjoy being young. I think most of us would agree with that statement. You should enjoy being young. Being young, having a childhood, having your adolescent years, they should be an enjoyable situation. Pursue hobbies and interests that you enjoy while you can, right? I know several men who really liked hiking and thought after they retired, they would do one of the big hikes like the Appalachian Trail or the Pacific Crest Trail. And then they found out when they had the time, they didn't have the stamina to do it. They would have loved to have been able to do it, but they couldn't. And so there's some element in this of have hobbies, have things in life that bring you joy, live with urgency. But when it says to follow our hearts, it says, have things that we enjoy, but it says whatever you see, whatever your eyes see. It would be easy for us, again, to interpret this as just kind of go by a whim, go wherever you want. Be, as Proverbs might call it, a simple person. But the teacher here is saying something different. The teacher here is saying, don't let what's right in front of you pass by you while you scheme about the future. I wish that my pastor would have preached this sermon when I was a teenager, because I think I wasted a lot of my teenage years dreaming about when I get to move out of my hometown. And thus, it continues to compound the issue of making my hometown seem like the worst place ever, because I didn't find joy in it. I was waiting for the day. My mind was not on what was in front of me. And so it says, look, there's a lot of stuff in front of you, but focus on what's right here in front of you. Hold it in its proper place so that you have joy. And then, because, it is sound advice, he says, but know that there are consequences. Have hobbies, find joy, see what's right in front of you, value it, and know that when you're young and you make a lot of mistakes, there's going to be some consequences for that. Know that that is coming. Know that Scripture doesn't tell us just do whatever you think is right. And then, no, it says God is the judge. God has standards. But we need to understand youth better in comparison to death, which is maybe not something we talk about death with young people enough. So the poem feels like it's a bit of a balancing act, right? There's a deadline, so enjoy it while you can. But remember the line and judgment it brings. Now, for most of us, I believe, this is just my take, that we are wired to favor one of those sides. We are consequences people, or we are seeking joy people. And the beautiful thing about the teacher is that he holds those two things in a balancing act all the way through this book. He says, look, we have to remember there's consequences. If we don't remember there's consequences, we do things that we ought not to do, right? If you've never seen anyone or met anyone in your entire life who's gotten a speeding ticket, why does it matter if I drive 90 through a neighborhood, right? We need to know that there are consequences, but there are also those people on the other side who are like, yeah, we need to just do what's fun. The teacher tells both, right? And so there's a bit of a balancing act there. In verse 10, it says, banish anxiety and cast off troubles, for youth and vigor are fleeting. Now, this might sound like procrastination for some of us. The children shouldn't have to bear the troubles of adult life. Let me say that again, because I think it's something that we need to hear. Children shouldn't have to bear the troubles of adult life, but sadly, because the world is broken, we know that they do. We know that it happens. But we ought to strive to minimize it. This is what the teacher is telling the gathered body. Remember, he's speaking to a community. We ought to strive to minimize the stress of adult life, impeding upon the preciousness of youth, the joy of being a young person. Now, what he's not saying is don't teach them important life skills, consequences, or values like saving money, sacrifice, and hard work. There's a balancing act here, and the fact that there are some people sitting in the pews that when I said the first statement, their mind jumped to the second one. Like, well, what about? That's why we have to hear it. That's why it's being taught to us, to hold it in attention, because we will go one way or the other. But a life of wisdom has both an understanding of death, an appreciation of consequence, but also an understanding that life is a gift and we should find joy in it. Both are found in this short poem. So the first poem, in my words, says this: let kids be kids. The years that lie ahead will have plenty of stress in store for them. There is a deadline and there's limited time, so live life urgently. It might seem odd to say there's a lot of life and to live urgently, but this is what the teacher says. Because we know there's a deadline, because we always remember the deadline, we live urgently. We value the time we have now. It's the only way for a young person to live a prudent and a wise life. Otherwise, they say, I have all the time in the world. I could take 5 years to figure something out. I could take 10 years and wait to do this, and they'll have wasted that time. But Jesus says it way better than any of us will ever say it. He says, can any one of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life? Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. Face what's in front of you with the perspective that we're supposed to find joy and that death is a real line for every single one of us. Now, I've used the word deadline a few times, and we're pretty familiar with the word deadline. It's in its modern use, it means when something is due. It's an assignment in school, a project at work, money to a bank or a lender, right? Implies that the set date or time is the last chance to accomplish it, right? Now, we know sometimes deadlines and the way we use it, they're soft deadlines, but it's a rigid line. That's the understanding. In a manner of speaking, there is no crossing that line. But the derivation means the origin of a word, where it comes from, of deadlines, a little bit different than how we use it today. You see, the word deadline comes out of Civil War. In the 1860s, we would have something called prison camps. This is a prison camp, Andersonville Prison, right? The Southern prison. And you'll see lots of tents, lots of fences, lots of all sorts of things. But if you have the full picture with the captions like I do, this little cluster of hospitals has an interesting caption. It says, hospitals along the deadline. Hospitals along the deadline. So if you do a little bit more research, you find out that the word deadline came into being spoken in English language because they would set up prison camps and they would say, you see that line? You cross that line, we shoot you. Just so we're on the same page. You cross that, that's the deadline. You don't pass it or we shoot you. And so the prisoners knew, they had a real sense of that is the boundary, right? Some of us, we poke and we prod at the boundary. They wanted to make very clear that is the boundary. That is the deadline. And so the hospitals are near it because people try to push that boundary. It's what we do. It's a bit more real, I think, than an email from your boss that says, get this to me by Thursday. That is, if you cross that line, we will kill you. And so living with a deadline is a bit different. The Civil War prisoners saw that line as a part of their daily life. If you can imagine what that does to your brain to wake up every single day and go do work and know that physical line on the ground, if I take a step past it, someone will kill me. It shaped the decisions they made. It provided them with perspective. But as many Civil War diaries tell us, because we still have a lot, they learned that consequences firsthand. It's just a line on the ground until you see someone cross it. It's just an abstract thing until you see the consequences of it. And just as the deadline shaped the view of people in that time, so does death shape that line for us. Ecclesiastes 12, 1 through 8. It's the second poem that we're going to read this morning, but it's not written to young people. It's not written as a message of enjoy life. It's written to those who have lived enough life that death is not an abstract line, but one that they've felt the sting of. And maybe one that they feel like they're ever pushing closer to. It's uncomfortable. We don't like to talk about it, but this poem is written for people who have death in sight. It's part of the reality of their life. Teenagers think they're invincible. People who've lived enough life, they see the line. It's part of their daily existence. It's a true deadline to them. So the poem seems to slow and kind of grind down as life peters out, and then it accelerates in other places with a real sense of the winding down and the death that is thrust upon us. The days of our youth are behind us, and the deadline lies ahead. It doesn't come out this way in our English translation, but this entire 8-verse poem is one sentence in the original Hebrew. So I'm just going to read it for you. I want you to hear this poem. It's hard to hear, but it's of wisdom and of truth. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the days of trouble came and the years approach, when you will say, I find no pleasure in them. before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars grow dark, and the clouds return after the rain, when the keepers of the house tremble and the strong men stoop, when the grinders cease because they are few and those looking through the windows grow dim, when the doors to the street are closed and the sound of the grinding fades, when people rise up at the sound of birds, but all their songs grow faint, when people are afraid of heights and of danger in the streets, when the almond trees blossom and the grasshoppers drag itself along, and desire no longer to be stirred. Then people go to their eternal home, and mourners go about the streets. Remember him before the silver cord is severed, the golden bowl is broken, before the pitcher is shattered at the spring, and the wheel broken at the well, and the dust returns to the ground it came from, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. Hevel, hevel, says the teacher. Everything is hevel. All right, as the reader of the poem finds themselves out of breath, because that's one sentence, that's one thought, it drags on, it drags on, it drags on. So too does life at the end. Finds itself out of breath, out of life. It's dragging, it's hard to breathe, it seems laborious. The last words from the teacher are not for those who have much life left to live, but for those who feel it slipping away. The last words of the teacher are not for the young. They're for those who life is hevel. Again, hevel is smoke. And you can just feel it slipping through your fingers. And it's a clever imagery, but it's a real one for a lot of us. You can't grab it. You can't go back to the younger years. You can't do the things that you used to be able to do. Life seems to be slowing down. And not a good slowing down, a gradual shutting down of sorts. The imagery in the poem is that of a community in a house, and things stop working. Verses 1 and 2 says this: remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the days of trouble come, the days when you say, I find no pleasure in them. It says then this, and this is kind of the apocalyptic end, the big scary part of the poem. Before the sun, the light, the moon, and the stars all grow dark. Before the end, remember the joy of youth. So he starts off by in the first poem saying, hey, young people, in your youth, remember the deadline. And then he says, hey, older people, you're nearer to the deadline. Remember your youth. It's an opposite perspective. It's for both ends of the spectrum. That when the days creep forth and maybe you're there and you would say, there are most days I wake up and I say, I find no pleasure in this. When it seems like the sun is getting dimmer and the light is getting dimmer and the moon and the stars are all kind of fading away. It's unpleasant. We don't like to talk about it, but it's real. Verses 3 through 5, there's a lot of debate over what it is. Is it an allegory? There are people who go through and pick up every little line and they tie it to a body part. Things start to shake, that's our legs as we get unstable. The grinders stop chattering, that's our teeth. There are other people that say, no, he's just talking about a funeral. And then there are others that say, like, no, it's just funeral-like feelings that are emoted. But any camp you choose, it's not pleasant. It says there's a slowing down, a ceasing to work. Bright things dim, vibrant things turn gray. You desire no longer stirs within you. Then people go to their eternal home, and mourners go about the streets. And then we get the second remember of the poem. Remember, the first remember of the poem says, remember your Creator in your days of young. The second says, remember him. And who did it say in verse 1 to remember your Creator? Because the end remembers, before the end, remember who gave you life. whether you feel like you lived it well, whether you feel like you want a few more years, whether you feel like you did do really well and you're ready, remember before the end who gave you life. The very end of this, it's on the front of our bulletins. It says, the spirit returns to the God who gave it, right? Gave it life. Life is fleeting. We can say it to young people and they'll say, yeah, that's fine because they have life ahead of them. But if you say it to a crowd of older people, you say, yeah, I feel that. Life is fleeting. Remember God. That's his only advice in this entire poem. Remember God. If you're young, remember God. If you're old, remember God. Life is short. It's fleeting. What we've said so far through 2 weeks, we said life is confusing. It's hard to predict. It's fleeting. It's impossible to control, and it's perplexing, but God is holy. And last week we said, yeah, it's all of those things, but it's a gift from God, so we're supposed to find joy in it. So our one big thing for this morning is this. You'll notice that the advice is dramatically different, but really the sentiment is the same. Younger people live a life that remembers God. Older people live life that remembers God. Life is fleeting. Remember God. If we are young and we have everything in front of us, it's very easy to think about ourselves. If we feel as though we're reaching the end and maybe we have things we would like to do and things that we would like to get done, it's very easy to think about ourselves. The teacher looks back at a long life lived and he says, whether you're young or you're old, it's going to look different. You're going to need to know different things, but you need to remember God. Maybe you had a Proverbs-like faith where you thought it was cause and effect, and you thought if I did this, then this will work out, and it didn't, and it blew up in your face. Remember God. There's no reason to follow God. There's always a reason to follow God, even when we can't see it. Remember God. Let's take a look at 2 passages from the New Testament that should, I think, guide us in this direction. What do we do as a community, as a church family? It says, whoever regards one day as special does so to the Lord. For none of us lives our lives alone, and none of us dies for ourselves alone. If we live for the Lord, and if we die for the Lord. So whether we live or die, we belong to the Lord. For this reason, Christ died and returned to life, that he might be the Lord of both the dead and the living. So Paul's talking to the church in Rome about some disagreements. It's actually right out of the middle of a passage of talking about food, what you can and can't eat. But he says that the grave is not the final deadline for Christians. Right? Jesus says it better, as always. In John 11, he says, the one who believes in me will live even though they die. Isn't that a beautiful thought? Whether we think in our minds, we perceive how close we are to that deadline, Christ says, the one who believes in me will live even though they die. But he's telling them this, look, whether you are trying to find the joy in every day or whether you're living for those special moments in your life, whatever season you're in, we need to live urgently, because it is not because we fear death, right? Live urgently as Christians, not because, when we die, that's all we have, but because we value each day as a gift from God and strive not to waste it. If we are Christians, then we believe that God has given us life for a purpose. Right? The teacher's speaking out of a uniquely Jewish setting. We are modern Christians. We know that we have the church and we have this call that we are supposed to carry. So to waste it on worry or pessimism is just that. It's a waste. We live each day in hope and we find joy in it. Elsewhere in the New Testament, again, Paul says this to the church in Philippi. He says, you probably know this one. For to me, to live is Christ and to die is gain. If I am to go on living in this body, this will mean fruitful labor for me. Yet what shall I choose? I do not know. I am torn between the two. I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far. But it is more necessary for you that I remain in the body. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain and I will continue with all of you for your progress and joy in the faith, so that through my being with you, Again, your boasting in Christ Jesus will abound on account of me. So we're familiar with Paul saying to live is Christ, to die is gain. But I want you to hear this morning. If you resonated more with the second poem than the first one, if you resonated with, I know the line, I've felt the line, I can feel the line. We don't like to talk about death, but we know it's part of our lives. I want to ask you, are you in Paul's shoes? Do you often feel torn between the two, between pressing forward and trying new things and doing things, or just saying, I've lived a lot of life, I've seen a lot of things, I'm done? Now, to be clear here, what we're not talking about is people who have lived enough life that they're at peace. What we're talking about is people who have lived enough life that they're embittered and they're welcoming death. Those are two different things. Paul understands that life is hard, right? I don't know all of your life stories, but it's hard for me to believe that very many of us lived a harder life than Paul. Shipwrecked and prison and beaten and all of these things. He understands and he says, look, going to be with Jesus sounds a lot better than keeping and doing this. But it is more necessary for us, for me, for the rest of the church, that you remain in the body and that you produce fruitful labor. Not that you just stick around, but that you pull your weight, that you do fruitful labor for the kingdom of God. Continue with all of us for our progress and joy in the faith. Let me ask you if you consider yourself an elder of the church, not an elder like a position. We don't have elders. I mean, an older person who has wisdom to share. Who will provide wisdom and perspective to our young if not our elders? Who will provide wisdom and perspective to our young if not our elders? We are in need of the teachers within our own community to give us that perspective of a life well lived. So let me put it bluntly for you. Do your job. Remember God. Let's pray.